What's going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 4 edition of Plugged In. I am your host, JM to Win from OneWeekSeason.com, here with my guest / host of the site Fantasy Points, where you are watching this, the great Scott Barrett. Scott, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. We didn't get a phone call this last week. But on the plus side, we're both keeping continuity with our outfits. You've got the black backward hat for, I think, the third straight week. I've got the black hat for the third straight week. So the viewers know what to expect from us, which is obviously critical from a trust perspective. And we'll get some good information too. So
here's the deal. Yeah, we're not going to trigger anyone by going with a green hat one week and they're like, I can't watch this. What is this? I expected black hats. Maybe we should rename it, the Black Hats Club or something. But yeah, here's the deal, JM. When you take down a tournament, a big one, let's say 50K or more, I'm going to rock a mustache in your honor on this show.
Ooh. Mm-hmm. Okay. So next Tuesday, Scott Barrett will have a mustache. Let's actually spend a moment here on your beard, which is really beautiful. How much time do you spend cultivating that thing?
Oh, legitimately zero. I just never really touch it. I know there's beard oil and beard balm. I don't do any of that. It's great for me because in high school, I used to get your celebrity doppelganger. Mine in high school was Michael Cera, which I felt was the worst one. I mean, in college, I started getting Edward Norton, so I think my bone structure changed a little bit.
That's a little bit better, yeah.
Every girl I've ever dated is always so mad when I shave my beard, and the great thing is it just grows back immediately. So I'm a big beard guy these days.
Yeah, if you got a good beard, nobody even has to know what your face looks like. You just the beard is what it is. All right, let's get to, now that we've talked facial hair, let's get to football stuff. How was your weekend? Any big takeaways from the weekend?
Oh God,
anything you want to get to off the top?
All right, so I had a profitable week, but playing GPPs only as usual. I wanted to be more intentional this week. Usually what I do is I throw in a bunch of lineups into the free contest and the $3 contest, just Thursday, something will come to me. I'll be like, oh, I'm going to build a lineup around that play. And this week I wanted to be more intentional. So I didn't make a single lineup until Saturday night. I wanted to be more ownership oriented, and ownership projections are best, Saturday night, Sunday morning. And so on our live stream, I talked about how much I loved Lamar Jackson this week as a contrarian, or as a pivot off of Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. Hurts obviously, was awesome and looks arguably the MVP favorite. But Lamar Jackson's ownership was coming in super low after he, wrecked the slate the week before. New England, more than any other defense, has historically struggled against hypermobile quarterbacks. And so, and Mark Andrews was one of my highest owned players of the slate. So it just made sense, rolling with that stack. And, but then Saturday night came around, and on the show, I had just said, I'm not really touching Patrick Mahomes. Not really. I don't think he's necessary. And, ideally all the points roll through Kelsey, but we have Andrews who's cheaper. And he's so expensive, it doesn't really kill you. Or he goes off and they just spread the ball around a lot. And then I saw the combined ownership, and I saw he was at 4%. I saw Kelsey was at 4%. And I saw Jonathan Taylor was at 7%. Also liked Alec Pierce as a cheap bring back. Had a few Juju Smith-Schuster. And there's the Gus Bradley thing, which I think is legitimate. How, Mahomes averaged 0.79 fantasy points per pass attempt against Gus Bradley last year, when Joe Burrow led the league with 0.50. And Gus Bradley had this interview, and he was like, no, we did my cover 3 shell did a good job last year. I'm not going away from that. And so like all these things lined up as this like contrarian stack, it seemed like no one was on. And so I ended up not having a single Lamar Jackson share so stupidly. And I had a bunch of Mahomes who like really disappointed. And again, I profited, but I went back and I self-flagellated and I looked at all these lineups. And if I had just swapped Kelsey and Mahomes for Lamar and Andrews, it could have been a 60K day. But other than that, I did really good. Maybe it was luck, but had 40% Mac Hollins, had a ton of Olave, a ton of Romeo Doubs, 0% David Montgomery, and like 0% a lot of the chalky guys who flopped. Did have some other lineups that like I thought were sharp. Some Geno lineups. I don't know. I don't remember.
I love that.
But I mean, it was a weird week because like, who do you pay up for? Because like everyone you could have paid up for like really shit the bed. Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, etc. So, and shout out to Graham Barfield who tried to talk us into Devonta Smith on the show, and he was met with like the most embarrassing silence from me and Johnny, and we were just like, nah, dog, nah. And he ends up being one of the best plays of the slate.
Graham Barfield, who used to be on this show with us, ditched us last year.
Right.
Claimed that he was too busy on
too busy for us peasants. Yeah,
too busy for us peasants. I want to highlight just from like as if you and I are just having a conversation standpoint. I think the fact that like a lot of times on these conversations, you've had a tendency to be like, well, if I had this player instead of this player instead of this player. And we've talked about the trap in that thinking because just mathematically how hard it is to get 9 spots right. And that is the way that not bad DFS players, like that's the way that DFS players stay like like below that elite level, right? Is always thinking like, oh, if I just swap these players and these players and these players. And so that shift to like you're talking about combos or game environments essentially, right? Like it was like you were on this Ravens game environment, you were on Lamar and Andrews, and you switched to like another sharp build, another sharp game environment for clear-headed reasons. And those things happen, right? Like I had I bubbled this last week. I got knocked out of the second week in a row where I've been profitable because of props, kind of making up for that game changer lineup not hitting, but I got knocked out of the money with like under 2 minutes left in the late games. But my build was building around Philadelphia having a strong offensive game, right? Putting up a ton of points. And so it was Hurts, Miles Sanders, AJ Brown, and the bringback was Curtis Samuel. But I did on Saturday afternoon mess around with, instead of Miles Sanders and Curtis Samuel, doing Devonta Smith and JD McKissick, which was essentially the same price. It was 100 less to make that swap because it's the same thing, right? If you're we're not betting on Washington keeping pace. The story we're telling is that the Eagles are going to trounce Washington and then Washington has to be passing to catch up. And if that's the case, McKissick's also in the game quite a bit, has a very similar role to what Curtis Samuel has in that situation. And to be clear, I spent like 10 minutes considering that. It wasn't like I was back and forth on it, but yeah, and that would have made, a huge difference. But again, there's, we've talked about this before. If you're finishing like on the cut line or like barely in the money, you actually have to assess and ask if you're playing poorly because you might be taking too few risks. And so like I would prefer to finish in last place than bubble, just because if I'm finishing in last place and I'm like, as long as they were good plays, I'm probably playing well because I'm playing that differently than everybody else. But actually, I've retrospectively felt great about the build, felt great about the approach, and it was just that, and that's what a lot of times it is, that one little switch, and you just, some weeks you end up on it, some weeks you don't. But if you're kind of always in that spot where you're on the right game environment and on the right sort of stuff, it's interesting to me that the ownership swayed you because Lamar was like under 1%, right? So was it just?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think it was, so by projected ownership, Lamar and Mahomes were both 4% for us. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm going to play the F out of Lamar. I'm not going to have a single share of Mahomes. And then I just saw like the combination of Kelsey, Mahomes, Taylor, and I just like totally forgot about Lamar and went in on these Mahomes stacks, which didn't work out. And maybe it was like a sharp play, decent process. But you just said something about, yeah. So like you always say, you really want to be finishing first or last, and that's always made sense to me, but never as much as it did when I watched your show with Squirrel Patrol on Roto Grinders. It's free. It's fantastic. And I think the point you make by that is like, you want to be unique enough with the field that you can finish all the way last or all the way in first. And I felt like I did a good job of that, where I was very unique. But I had these, the key plays like the Mac Hollins plus Chris Olave or whatever. So I don't know, but like let's focus in on that, and I'll share a text I got with one of my buddies, and I'll make him listen to the show, and I think it'll be worthwhile for him. He sent me a text. He showed me his GPP lineup, and it was Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, and a few other chalky guys. And I'm like, all right, well, what are you entering? What are your goals? What are you trying to do? And he said, I'm trying to stay afloat by getting green in GPPs. Once I feel like I can consistently win, then I'll go more risk heavy and more contrarian. Yeah. Okay.
Did you give him the business from there?
I did, but I would like, I think you could do a better job than I could.
Well, it's you have to finish in the top 20% just to double your money in tournaments. So just the math on it, it's something that's going to happen 1 out of every 5 times just to double your money. And in most tournaments, you have to finish top 12%, top 10% to more than double your money. And so in other words, you have to finish like out of every 10 rosters, you have to finish first out of every 10, right? It's like 10%, or 1 out of every 10 weeks, you'll finish in a position where you are finishing above. And so that's such a mindset thing, right? And I get it. I actually talked about this on the Inner Circle podcast yesterday. It came out today for Inner Circle members on the site, where we kind of focus on the training stuff. But I can't tell you how many in like MLB, how many times I had where I had a stretch like 2 weeks without cashing in a tournament. And then I just like barely cashed one day. And then like the next 3 days just fired off, top 5 finishes, because it does boost your confidence and you feel a little bit better pulling the trigger on some things. But if you are actively building with that mindset, you're never going to finish in first place, because the time it takes for that to pay off, right? For you to finish in the green, it's like you can build mediocre rosters and finish in the green. And it might take you 5 or 6 weeks. And then you've got to wait till the next week to start pulling the trigger on the other ones. But then you also have it in your mind, like, okay, but this worked before, and you want to go to these safer plays. And it's like the only reason to play tournaments is to target first place. And if the edges in, this stood out to me this last week. And this is one of the reasons too, why we focus on matchup, right? And we focus on that's like, let me say this too, Scott, like you going to the Ravens and a little bit less so the Chiefs, because like we hadn't seen the Colts defense. We knew that they could, like the Chiefs could win in that matchup, right? But the Patriots matchup, it was still one that a lot of people were scared of. That's why nobody was on Lamar, even after his big blow up. And the willingness to go there and be like, well, like explosive players over matchup, right? And low ownership on an explosive player, that's what we want to take. And so that willingness to kind of go off the board a little bit in that regard that's what's going to put you on a path to first place. And so if you're sitting here and like, okay, I'm going to play tight and I'm going to play these safe guys, well, it's going to be so hard to ever get off of those tight and safe guys down the road to build for first place. And you're just going to bleed out money over time. And you're always going to have that kind of in the back of your head, like, oh, but I cashed this week when I played things this way. And you just have to have that willingness to like play DFS instead of playing the matchups, to play the game that you're actually playing, because the edges are so thin. So going back to what I was going to say before, Andy Reid was talking after the game this last week. He said, the parity in the NFL is crazy and you can't make any mistakes. So we think so much about these matchups and all that, right? But realistically, all the teams are generally roughly as talented as the other teams, and any team can beat any other team on a given week, especially if the better team makes 5, 6, 7 mistakes throughout the game and the worst team makes none. Like the edges are that thin. And so if we take that over to DFS, when you factor in the fact that there's a lot of good players and then the site is taking out the rake, the edges are so thin that you can't afford to give up edge. You can't afford to give up weeks. You can't mathematically afford to have weeks where you're like, all right, I'm just going to like play tighter this week. Or even like this last week, Hilo had a really busy week on his end and got to Saturday and he was like, I just don't feel as prepared as I normally do. And he pulled back on his buy-ins, right? And that's hard to do because we get so few weeks in the NFL, but it's like, you can't afford to give up edge because the edges are so important. And so you really do have to attack every week as if it's a live final, right? You have to attack every week as if you're playing for first place. And another thing I talked about on Inner Circle this week is, one of the things that helped me a lot was when I first started playing DFS, I played tournaments for like 2 weeks and then I spotted qualifiers. And that was all I did for a couple of months was qualifiers. And it hammers in this first place or nothing mindset. And I encourage listeners on Inner Circle this week, I said, go in the DraftKings lobby and go to like the satellites and qualifiers tab and just scroll down. There's so many like $1 satellites. There's so many 25-cent satellites where first place is the only one that gets the ticket. And you can put in just like a tiny fraction of your bankroll, but build a roster specifically for that contest where it's like, literally, if I don't get first place, it doesn't matter at all. I don't get anything. And you start training yourself to shift over to that type of thinking. And I think that the pervasive talk about who the sharp plays are on a slate, it's all about who the sharp cash game plays are realistically. And that pervasive talk, though, makes people feel like, well, I've got to be on this guy. I ran through the list in the Inner Circle pod of like all the 11 guys that I would have considered the people we were scared to not play this last week. And all 11 of them failed at their price. And most of them were like under 2x, right? Some of them were under 1x. And it's like every week, crazy things are going to happen. And so you just have to position yourself to take advantage of that. And otherwise, you shouldn't be playing tournaments. Go play cash games, right? If you need that confidence boost, or do props instead of cash games and make even more money. And then, you've got some excess money and use that as your confidence boost to attack tournaments. But yeah, like it's the only reason to play tournaments is to target first place.
Yeah. So this is what I said to him. This is me doing my best JM impression. Like I don't live this as well as you live it, but I'm working on it. So his lineup, like I said, it was like super chalky. And the one unique piece was like Ian Thomas at tight end. So it's like, unless
Ian Thomas has his 25-point game, then
like that, hey, and like every other thing hits that the field has, maybe, but very likely not. So again, he was saying like he wants to finish it in the green for like 5 weeks in a row, and then he'll play higher stakes and he'll play more contrarian, more aggressive. And I'm just like, yeah, that's wrong. Just play cash then. Like the pros view consistent green in tournaments as bad. Like thinking of you is like, first place or last place. They would rather finish dead last because at least then you're unique. And then beyond that, consistent green is like impossible. Who is the best DFS GPP player in the game? You could Osimo, Big T, whatever, guys like that. Like they're living and dying on like the weeks where they, finished first, and then they'll have like 4 down weeks. And it's just like, whatever, I'm waiting for that next first place finish. You really live and die on that unless you're, playing super high stakes where it's different. You're competing only against like, 40 people, but it's also so top heavy, like the payouts where, first place in the milli versus 10th place is like, what, 1,000x, 100x, something insane like that. And so when you're playing in these tournaments, it's better to have, one first place finish and then every other lineup dead last. And then for the next 4 weeks, dead last, just having that one first place than having every single lineup in the 50th percentile and maybe even in the top, 20th percentile. And so really that needs to be the focus. So I like what you said, where it's like it ingrained that mindset into you playing these qualifier tournaments. And I think that's right. I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean those playing those satellites, and like there's one that's like 100 entries, and it's a $5 buy-in, and it's a ticket to the Wildcat, which is the 333 entry. And for a lot of people, $5, like that fits in their bankroll for the week, right? Where it's like, if I lose, it's a small enough amount that if you lose it, you don't care. So you're willing to play fearlessly with it. It's a 2 entry max. So you could even fire $10 in there and just like take those shots to say, look, I'm going to try to get entry into the Wildcat. Now, the hard thing is then you win the ticket and you can try to play a little bit tighter because you're like, oh, I want to turn $10 into 500, right? And just finishing the money in here. But yeah, it's that's what DFS is all about. And that's why when people say, oh, there's no edge in DFS. Well, they say that because they're thinking that DFS is about picking players. And we've gotten really good at this point of picking who the best plays on a slate are, in terms of if we could play out the slate 100 times, what would make you the most money in cash games, right? But when you talk about how people play DFS, the idea of building rosters instead of picking players is still so foreign to most people, in terms of like putting together a roster that gives you a clear path to first place. And then even beyond that, that idea of actually building for first place. Everybody thinks that they're building for first place, but they're really just building, like getting good players onto a roster that they like. And all that does is like, again, try to get them into the green. And so there's a good like 80% of the general field that literally doesn't have a path to first place unless they just get super lucky. And so if you can kind of shift over to that other 20% of the field where you're at least building strong rosters and aiming for first place and building rosters that can hit first place, you're going to make money over time, even if you're playing tournament heavy. And you have to understand the math and like how long it can take for this to play out in your favor. But still, like once you're putting yourself in that position, it's going to start paying off in your favor. And yeah, I mean, also fire in, get some extra action and play if you can, showdowns and afternoon only slates and stuff like that, so that you can kind of expand that sample size as well. That can help.
The thing I love about this show is so I'm weak in theory. I've accepted it, and you're extremely strong in theory, and so it feels like I'm like this is me paying you, I don't know, $500 a week to like sit with me for an hour and like mentor me in terms of theory. So like I love this, and I really feel like it's valuable. So I hope the listeners feel the same way. I want to pick your brain on something else. I know this is like a bad mindset, and this is like, you know, like what the DFS losers do. But I made one lineup on I made one lineup on FanDuel this week, and so it was just like the $5 milli. Like I really don't like FanDuel. I only like check it just to get the salaries and then play around with it because I have to give analysis on it. And so I was just like, yeah, you know what, YOLO, screw it. And so the lineup I built was bad. It had Adams, Jefferson, Tyreek, and like all of them sucked. But like I had to go cheap, and so I was looking for cheap plays. I think I had Geno, Lockett, maybe ended up on Patterson. I don't know, but it like lost. It sucked. But my RB2, I seriously considered Khalil Herbert. I didn't play it. I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do it. But I mean, like he had 10 touches in week 1, looked amazing, far more efficient than David Montgomery. And Montgomery was the chalk of the week. So it's just like, hey, you know, if he flops and this guy goes off, that's like massive leverage. Is that do you think that would have been a good pre-hindsight play, or it was still too thin? Because I kind of think it was still too thin.
It would have looked like you just got incredibly lucky, right? I remember one week when a couple years ago, do you remember the week when Michael Pruitt scored like 2 touchdowns? It was last year or the year before, and Jeff El Jefe had used Michael Pruitt as his cheap tight end, right? It's more like, you know, this guy can randomly score a touchdown, and then there ended up being an injury, and Michael Pruitt was like playing all the snaps and had this big game, right? But the thing with Khalil Herbert is the Bears don't want to pass the ball, right? Like we could describe how Khalil Herbert gets 15 to 17 touches without David Montgomery getting hurt. The Bears don't want to pass the ball. They're playing Houston, who is, you know, going to take away deep passing and probably be beatable on the ground. and the Bears were actually favored in that game, weren't they? And so it's like you could literally see there being 35 combined rush attempts and the Bears giving 18 to 20 of these to Montgomery, and then the other 15 to 17 to Herbert. So, I mean, I actually think, you're talking a $5 buy-in where you have to beat thousands, hundreds of thousands of entries. Like, I actually think that's a sharp way to look at it, right? Because your average result is losing that money. I saw somebody, or it was on our best ball pods during the summer, and I don't remember who said it. I know we had on Chess Liam and Justin Herzig on a couple of different pods who won the last 2 best ball manias. So it might've been one of them, but they basically said that if you factor in the rake, as soon as you've bought into the best ball mania, what is the best ball mania? $25 buy-in is like, as soon as you bought in, your $25 is worth like $22. And so to try to protect that money is just like the most asinine way to approach these contests. It's like it's already worth less than what you put in the moment you bought it, just because of the rake. And so you have to then think, like, I don't want to just get that money back, double that money, right? You have to build in such a way that you're like, I'm going to get all of this back. So if you were in like a small field contest, it would be totally unnecessary to go with Khalil Herbert. But if you're in a large field contest like that, and you're saying this is a guy who all you really even needed was 15 touches and he gets the touchdowns, right? He gets 2 touchdowns and all of a sudden, he's breaking all of these Montgomery rosters and he's getting you the points. Now, it would have been just totally fortunate that Montgomery got hurt, but in a contest of that size, I honestly love it. I think that those are the types of plays that can win those contests, is these sub 1% plays that can actually go for a lot more points than people realize. And yeah, I mean, I think especially if you're playing on FanDuel, that's like all the volume is gone from FanDuel, right? And so that's like the contest to play on there anyway. And shout out to DraftKings for stealing all the volume over the last 7-8 years. And in fact, DraftKings volume is like way higher this year than it was last year. I don't know if you've noticed that, but contests have been sized up, and I think it's crypto crashing. All the crypto bros and NFT bros that were last year, like, why would I play DFS this year? They're like, maybe I'll play some DFS. But yeah, DFS is pretty healthy this year, and especially on DraftKings. But yeah, I think
who is the NFT of fantasy players? Is it DJ Moore, CD Lamb? You're just like, oh, this guy's gonna be good. Like, I know it. He's just never.
Travis Etienne.
Etienne.
third round pick as the 1B back. On his yeah. There's a few of those where throughout drafting season, it's like, you guys are really drafting to the upside. Everyone's arguing about Gabe Davis, and I'm like, I mean, this dude, at least we know he has a role. He could score multiple touchdowns in a game. What are these other guys? Like, we don't even know if they have a role. Cam Akers is kind of up and down as the lead back. But yeah, I mean, I think that like that type of thinking, and again, it's always about contest size. And I think that also you said that about waiting till Saturday night last week. And that's something I mess around with rosters so much throughout the week because I like to get a sense of all the unique combinations that you can put onto a roster and kind of the unique paths that you can build. But on the flip side of that, one of the drawbacks of me doing that is I can get so invested into one particular game or team early on. And then I think it's less about me getting so invested that I can't get off them and more about I get so invested that my content focuses like on what a great spot that is. And then when I get to building, it's like, I literally have to. So like this last week, I was really high on the Vikings-Lions game, which was obviously sharp. I mean, everybody would have been high on that game. There was no reason not to be, but I had kind of talked up that game so much throughout the week that by the time I got to Saturday and I started thinking, like, it's not impossible for Amon-Ra St. Brown to have 15 to 17 points and for there to be much better paths to first place. And it was like, okay, but I have to have him on my roster, like I literally have to. And so this week I was thinking, like coming off this last week, I was like, I really should wait until Saturday to take any like firm stances and wait until ownership comes out, because so much of DFS is just that strategy of saying, well, if this guy's this low owned and he has this much upside, maybe I'll go here instead, because the more we focus on the matchups, the more we can take ourselves out of that ability to kind of go to these guys who break the matchup mold a little bit. And even like, so like this next week, I made some notes for today that we probably won't get to a ton of this, but second best game environment on the slate, according to like game totals and spreads, Browns versus Falcons. And it's going to get some steam throughout the week because there's nothing on this slate. It's like Ravens, Bills, and then Browns, Falcons. And then you've got some teams with high totals. The Eagles have a high total. The Lions have a high total. And it's like, that's the type of week that it is, right? And so people are going to realize, okay, like sharp players are going to realize, well, this game total stands out, and people aren't going to want to load up on Browns, Falcons this week. And it's going to be low ownership relative to what it should be based on this over under. But just being able to wait until Saturday and say, okay, what are these game totals that actually look better than people realize, or the explosive players who people are overlooking, and find a way to build in that way, right? And so I think you had a super sharp process this last week of waiting until ownership projections were at their best to build those things. And
I'm not doing that again.
No.
I mean, so what I usually do is I make a bunch of lineups throughout the week, but they're in like at most the $3 or the free, and then Saturday I'll be more ownership oriented, but also like look back at those lineups and I'm like, hey, actually that was really good, and then make more lineups. This week I kind of I saw that Mahomes thing, and I just, you
can do that too, though, like building throughout the week, as long as you're not like just trying to. So like I build all my practice builds that don't go into contests, and through that I can get a sense of who the best plays are. But I don't. There people like Levitan used to always ask, what if one of these is the nuts, and you built like 80 rosters, one of these is the nuts, and you didn't put it in? And I'm like, it's so rarely going to be the nuts, because I'm not actually building a roster with intentions of getting first place. Like I'm building a roster with intentions of getting a feel for the slate. But if you're building stuff to get like early in the week, as long as it's not just like, okay, I'm trying to get a feel for who the best plays are, and it's more like what's something that could win this tournament, and you build it that way, it doesn't matter at what point in the week, because you don't have to look at ownership projections to know what's going to be unique enough to win. The hardest thing, though, is especially for like guys like you and me who are so deep into the numbers and the matchups and actually understanding what these teams are good and bad at, is that we can be so focused on like, okay, this is one of the sharp plays, this is one of the sharp plays, and just try to collect all those on a roster. And by Saturday, most of those plays are going to be popular, because there are other people besides you and me who are also good at finding the sharp plays, and they're talking about them. And then you and I are finding those sharp plays and talking about them. And like by the time we hit Saturday, those plays are generally somewhat popular. So it's like you can build throughout the week, but you still have to build and say, what could win first place? What might people not be on? You got to throw your Flacco and Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson, which, I was really tempted. I threw that out there as like a joke last week that was going to win the Millie in week 3. And like up until Saturday, I was still like, I could literally put that on my main roster and feel good about it, like from an upside perspective. But now we get Zach Wilson back, which is
so this is something I
going to wreck that offense
in my notes. And this is like a sort of wish casting, like Elijah Moore is going to win me $1 million. Like it's going to happen. But for 3 straight weeks, I've only had one Millie Maker lineup, and that was always intentionally my most unique, most contrarian lineup. And for 3 straight weeks, I've either double X'd or triple X'd my buy-in for that. I finished in the green, the Millie Maker, which again, like you want to finish first or last. But the weird thing is, those were Flacco teams. Every single week so far was a Flacco line, and it's finished in the green in what's supposed to be like the toughest tournament to hit green in. And I talked about this in I forget what we titled the article. Oh, the Large Field DFS Tournament Cheat Sheet. But I really talked about how much like I love playing one random low-owned cheap quarterback with his stacking partner. Last week, Geno Smith popped because Seattle's been more aggressive. They've been running at a faster pace than you'd expect. They just like can't sustain drives, but this is the perfect matchup. Falcons defense, they've been like the worst defense against quarterbacks for 4 years running. With Lockett, who is like the wide receiver 28 by salary, but the wide receiver 12 by receiving yardage props. DK Metcalf is going to get shadowed by AJ Terrell, and then you could bring it back with London, Pitts, Patterson. And so you were just talking about the games that stood out to you, and immediately 2 games stood out to me. And that was, like you said, Cleveland at Atlanta. Jacoby Brissett is like quietly, the 3rd most efficient quarterback in football by EPA per play. And this is like the stone nuts matchup. Amari Cooper has hit the 100-yard bonus and scored a touchdown in 2 straight games. Though again, AJ Terrell is going to shadow, so maybe it's a DPJ week or Njoku. And then tied with them for second in over/under is Geno again at Detroit. And it could be another Lockett week. Jeff Okudah has been phenomenal shadowing. I forget if you're a wide receiver CB truther like I am. So yeah, it could be Geno and Lockett, and Detroit's offense looks awesome and their defense looks terrible, and they run at a fast pace. So that's what popped to me. And then beyond that, I had a tweet, but basically if you throw out the second half of Jalen Hurts games, he's averaging over 50 fantasy points per 4 quarters, which is just insane. So it's imagine if one of these teams can keep things competitive. Imagine if Jacksonville can keep things competitive. He could really destroy the slate. So that's the 4th highest over/under, and then first is Buffalo at Baltimore with their depleted secondary, and obviously that makes all the sense in the world.
You know what? I wish that this Philly and Jacksonville game were in Jacksonville, because it's going to be such a tough environment. And Doug Peterson going back, those fans are going to be so rowdy, and that's a tough spot for this Jaguars team. But if it were in Jacksonville, man, I'd be I don't know, the Jags can go blow for blow with Philly, and yeah, any of these hot stretches, they're going to come to an end in terms of when you extrapolate the numbers out over a season and you're oh, okay, literally this guy can't keep this up. Or when a pass catcher scores, a touchdown in each of the first 3 games, or Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, had 3 touchdowns through the first 2 games. Jahan Dotson had 3 through the first 2 games. And you also have to recognize just basic touchdown regression means there's going to be a stretch where they're not scoring and everybody's expecting them to score. Basic regression on Hurts is he's going to have a down game somewhere. The Jags are going to come up with a game plan, or another team's going to come up with a game plan. Somebody is. But when you look at that game, it stands out as one that's, I really like this last week. They asked Doug Peterson in the post-game press conference after his win in LA. They said the players' demeanor on the sideline looks like they expect to win. And they asked him about that and what if he's seen a progression throughout the offseason and the early part of the season. And that is because of the talent level kind of being similar across teams across the board, right? And obviously some teams are more talented than others, but the gap isn't as huge as our perceptions of these teams are. And if you have that team like the Jags, that every year there's a team that kind of comes from nowhere. The Jags are in the AFC South. They could literally make the playoffs. You know what I mean? They can beat the Titans. They can beat the Colts. They can win 2 games against Houston and actually be a playoff team this year. And the Lions, same thing. The Lions could be a playoff team this year. And when you have that shift on the players where they literally see themselves differently than we on the outside currently see them, they see themselves as an elite team that can go in and win in any game environment. That should stand out to us too. And I don't think the Jags are going to go into this game against Philly scared. I don't think they're going to go in looking thinking of themselves as doormats. They're going to go in there thinking that they can win this game. And I think it'll be competitive. And yeah, I think that Hurts one is super interesting. And I think that this is also that's why this week, when I was kind of looking at things yesterday, this week's slate, it's this is a good week to wait to build main rosters until ownership sort of really comes into full view, because there are spots that are going to seem so obvious, but might end up missing. Actually, I got a spot for you. Jamal Williams, right? DeAndre Swift is probably going to miss this game. Jamal Williams just seems like a lock button play. And then you look back at last year, the 2 games that Swift missed, Jamal Williams played 47.2% of the snaps and 41.8% of the snaps. Now, he might come out this week and play 75% of the snaps, but it's recognizing that there are places where these guys can fail. Or last week, Buffalo's missing all of their secondary, and Miami just got done torching Baltimore for all these points. It's so easy to be oh my God, how could Miami not hit in this spot? And one of the things that Mike Johnson wrote up was just thinking like a coach, what is Buffalo going to do? Buffalo's going to say, look, shell coverage, whatever we do, we're not going to get beat deep. And we're not going to put a ton on these guys' plates of hey, go win the matchup. We're just going to say, let's out scheme them and force them to run the ball and throw underneath, right? And when you think about things from that perspective, it's oh, maybe this isn't as much of a can't miss spot as you think. And no spot is as much of a can't miss spot as you think. And so it's a nice week to kind of wait, at least to some extent, and see like where is like if there's 20%, now this wouldn't probably happen on a quarterback, but if there were 20% on Jalen Hurts, where it's like, oh, he just can't fail at this point, he can, right? And so then you can say, especially at his price tag, then you can say, cool, like where else do I go? But if we get toward the end of the week and he's 7%, then you can be like, just go Jalen Hurts, simplify things, right? And so a week like this is really interesting because it's really ugly. And it's going to be so easy to just be like, why would I go off of Buffalo, Baltimore? Or why would I go off of Jalen Hurts? These are the only spots that really stand out or make sense. If everybody's off that Browns-Falcons game, man, I mean, that's one that could pop. And one thing I like about the Browns is Kevin Stefanski's always done a really good job of less so having like, hey, this is our offense, and more so these are our weapons, and we're just going to use these guys. We don't see a lot of targets bleed out to their second-tier players. A lot of touches bleed out to their second-tier players. Kareem Hunt had exactly 15 touches in all 3 games this season as technically their RB2, right? Like Nick Chubb is the headline. He's been dominating this year. And yet Kareem Hunt's getting 15 touches per game because they're like, well, he's also one of our best players. We're going to make sure that these are the guys touching the ball. And so, yeah, I mean, some of these spots are interesting. It's going to be a really interesting week. And we've had an interesting season so far. We had like all the chalk hit week 1. And then week 2 was kind of a weird week where all these kind of bad games and just one game that blew up. And then this last week, nothing hit. And so I think that the average DFS player, their head's going to be spinning a little bit. Like if chalk hits 2 or 3 weeks in a row, everybody's like, oh, just play the chalky players. But when we have this rhythm that we've had so far this season, I think a lot of people are going to be like, I don't know what to do or where to go. I don't know where to feel comfortable. And that'll open up some paths for us to outmaneuver people this week.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking was Jacksonville trucked Indianapolis, winning 24-0. And I wonder if that's some sort of like screw this Frank Reich guy, because, you know, everyone was saying he was the true genius and mastermind behind the Super Bowl. And, you know, he has a chip on his shoulder. Maybe Jacksonville really comes out and plays this week.
When I was
his former team
watching or listening to Doug Peterson's post-game press conference, I had that thought of like, because I love Frank Reich, and I was one of those guys.
Yeah, me
like,
too. I'm a Frank
was
Reich
it really
trigger.
Doug Peterson? You know, they're like, look, they can both be good coaches. You know, like this dude has transformed this doormat brand. I mean, and the Jags could finish the season 6-11 or 7-10, right? But he's still like transformed this team, regardless of what their final record is. Like this is a team that looks like they're going to play winning football. They're not going to beat themselves. They're going to come out and be consistent and make good decisions, make good play calls, and manage the game well. And I think, you know, no player's not going to enjoy playing for Doug Peterson too. Like that's a thing that he's going to create an environment where these guys, you're not playing for Ron Rivera or Bill Belichick, where it's like, if you're winning with those guys, you're like, okay, like this is what's working. These guys are complete assholes, and like that's okay because we're winning. If you start losing with those guys, then you're like, I don't want to be here, right? Like I feel like Doug Peterson's going to get, that's Urban Meyer last year. That's Doug Peterson's going to keep getting the most out of this team, and getting ahead of those things is valuable too, man. Like you could even, Philadelphia defense has looked great this year, but you could even load up on the Jacksonville side of that game and just say Jacksonville is a better offense than people realize, you know? So I think that this is an interesting week. It's a very unique slate that we have just in terms of the way, it's not like we're missing a ton of top offenses, but just the way that the matchup sets it up as a really interesting week ahead. Hey, I've got one for you. Mm-hmm. The Cardinals are implied to score 20.75 points against the Panthers. And I've thought about this the last 2 weeks, right? If you just take explosive players and don't worry about matchup, they can hit, because we've seen that with Lamar back-to-back weeks. Like explosive players can beat tougher matchups or perceived tougher matchups. And so it's easy to be like, well, the Cardinals could end up, Kyler is averaging under 5 carries per game across his last 7 games. Last week, Patrick Mahomes, in one of his press conferences, called himself a running quarterback, and then he corrected himself. He's like, I'm not a running quarterback. He's like, I'm a quarterback who can run. And I feel like that's what Kyler's like, I'm not a running quarterback. I'm a quarterback who can run. But this quarterback who's not a running quarterback, he threw for 300 plus yards 5 times his rookie year. You know, teams didn't have a lot of tape on him. Since then, 7 out of 33 games with 300 plus yards. And since Hopkins went down last year, Kyler has yet to throw for more than 2 touchdown passes in a game. So given that Kyler has like, what is this, a 9-game sample size, 10, 11 game sample size of not being able to top 2 touchdown passes. He doesn't frequently throw for 300 yards and he doesn't run the ball anymore. Can we look at him as like, can we look at this as a sneaky spot where people just aren't? Obviously, Carolina plays like a nickel heavy coverage, right? I mean, defense. They put a lot of light men on the field and dare teams to run against them and to try to take away the pass. Is this a spot where we can be like, the Cardinals could just blow up, right? Because I feel like a lot of sharp DFS players who don't know the NFL as well are just going to look at this spot and be like, yeah, but nobody's going to be on Kyler. He could just hit big. But knowing the NFL well, like, are his chances of hitting big lower than people are going to think?
This is just a tricky question. I was like super in on Kyler week 1. I was very in on Kyler week 2, and then Johnny was in on him week 3, and I was just like, I can't do it. Like he's not running. He doesn't look good. But the upside's clearly there. You know, your stat about, passing yardage games, but he has 2 400 plus passing yardage games over his last 20. He has more 35-point fantasy point games per start than any quarterback in NFL history. And when he does run, like, he has that Jalen Hurts, Lamar upside. And if you're Cliff Kingsbury, how are you not just being like, listen, you with you throwing it, it's not getting it done. You may think you're a quarterback who runs and not a whatever you put it. No. We need you running 10 times per game. If you don't get to 80 rushing yards, we're going to lose. Like, what are you doing? I don't know, man. These are 2 tricky teams. Arizona ranked 15th in yards per play last year. Now they rank 4th worst. And then Carolina, it's Christian McCaffrey went 23 straight games exceeding 17 fantasy points. He's fallen short of that mark in all 3 games this year. DJ Moore finished top 10 in receiving yards in 3 straight seasons. Right now he ranks like 87th. And it's just like, how bad is Matt Rule? How bad is Baker Mayfield? It's pretty bad. Like Christian McCaffrey is a demigod. DJ Moore was a top 10 receiver with only quarterbacks who are no longer in the league and like not even worthy of the practice squad. And you can make an easy, hey, these guys are really good. Like, just play them. They're gonna rebound, of course. But like right now for both teams, it looks super ugly. Another guy. So I started on XFP early. I started last night, and that's something I really need to do every single week. It just makes that article so much better. It makes the show better. And we talk about regression to the mean. And one thing to spot regression to the mean where it's very easy and it always comes is touchdown regression. Unless you're Jacoby Myers, then it never comes. But otherwise, regression always comes, and it's like, who are the biggest touchdown regression candidates? Zach Ertz, he's like 4,600. He's priced as like the wide receiver 55. He's hit double-digit targets in 7 of his last 9 healthy games. And he also like leads all receivers in end zone targets over that span, and yet he only has 2 touchdowns. If you spot him those missing touchdowns, and he had an end zone drop last week, if you spot him those missing touchdowns, he's basically Travis Kelce. He's basically, the production Keenan Allen was giving us last year. And so I'm just going to keep chasing that. Like, granted, he's not that good. His quarterback doesn't look great. The offense isn't great. He's the least efficient receiver in NFL history on a missed tackles forced per reception basis. But I'm still chasing that. Just like that target volume from like a position that's otherwise extremely gross and dead. Another guy is Joe Mixon. He currently leads all players in XFP per game. He's averaging 2 opportunities inside the 5-yard line, 3 opportunities inside the 10-yard line per game. If you spot him as missing touchdowns, like if he was just perfectly average in touchdown efficiency, and that's like always the expectation, but always regresses the mean, he'd be the far and away the RB1. He'd be, he has the best volume, and like we know this offense should be good. And so those are some other things I guess I'm thinking about. But yeah, the Arizona, Carolina, just like those 2 teams, like, hey, right now we only have a 3-week sample size, and everyone could just be like, oh, these teams suck. And it's like, oh, wait, no. We were drafting Kyler top 5 for a reason. We were drafting CMC, me personally, 101 for a reason. DJ Moore, round 3 for a reason, et cetera, et cetera.
I like that take. I mean, especially the thing about the 3-week sample size still being so small, because the game total is like 43, right? Like, it's just so ugly. But if Kyler gets going, who's to say that against that Arizona defense, Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore couldn't get going? I think that people love playing DJ Moore in DFS, but I think people also don't realize how good DJ Moore is, because he's typically had those touchdowns taken away from him by Christian McCaffrey over the years, or by bad quarterback play. And he's typically a lot farther down in terms of touchdowns scored than the average alpha receiver. But people don't recognize like how many catches, how many yards he really gets. And that if he ever has a season, right? I think it was Mike Evans the year after his rookie season, his second year in the league, he had 2 touchdowns all season. And so it's easy to look at these guys and be like, oh, Mike Evans doesn't score touchdowns. But we know at this point that Mike Evans can definitely score touchdowns. He has like that profile. He has that body. It's what's going to happen with Mike Evans most seasons. And yet that regression can come. And so somebody like DJ Moore, I think he still just doesn't get the respect that he should get, because like he's a top 10 wide receiver with bad quarterback play outside of touchdowns scored. And if there's a season where all of a sudden DJ Moore has 14 touchdowns, everybody's going to be drafting him like in the second round the next year, because they're going to be like, oh, this guy put up so many fantasy points last year. Yeah, I think that's an interesting game. And when we're looking at, another one that's interesting, I don't think I'll be on it because both defenses have been playing really well, but Kansas City and Tampa, like Mike Evans is going to be back this week. And like just explosive offenses that can significantly outperform the game totals. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to look for this week. And on the flip side of that too, it could be a week in which Buffalo and Baltimore go off and none of these other games hit, right? And you play these other games and you don't make money because of that. And yet you still play DFS correctly, because if we take this weekend and say, what if we played it 100 times, you're going to make a lot more money trying to find that spot that hits at much lower ownership, right? As opposed to that spot where, it's Tuesday when we're recording this. So maybe ownership won't congregate on that top game the way I'm going to talk about here. But like, if like all the players in that game are 15, 20% owned, it's just so hard to find your path to a first place finish, because you've got to get those plays right just to keep even with the field. And then you've got to get the other plays right on top of that. And so just mathematically, your chances of winning first place are so much lower going that direction than going a different direction on a week like this. So, and that's not to say I won't, like, if I build around another game, I'll probably still have pieces from that game, but it's like, you just try to capture the main piece from that game. Actually, speaking of things that we almost got right last week, Josh Allen was talking last week about all the pressure Miami brings and how important it is to have a game plan to account for that pressure. And I went back through their game logs against Miami the last 2 seasons, and their last 3 games, the players who hit big were, one game it was Zach Moss catching passes out of the backfield, one game it was Cole Beasley, and one game it was Isaiah McKenzie. And the only reason I didn't pull the trigger on it was because I was thinking like Crowder and McKenzie are still splitting time, and like which one of them. But the whole reason McKenzie is in there is because the Bills want somebody who can make something happen after the catch. Like Crowder's a great slot receiver, but McKenzie can make something happen after the catch. Well, if you're playing Miami, you have to put up points and you're trying to beat the blitz. You don't want Crowder being the guy that you're building the game plan around just to pick up some catches. You want McKenzie to be the guy because he can hopefully make some explosive plays happen. So I was pretty disappointed in myself for not pulling the trigger on that one, because it just like stacked up from a way that I think that was, let's rewind back to like 2014, 15. That was kind of how I initially built my reputation in the DFS space, was thinking through how coaches and teams are going to approach an individual game. And then that ends up getting you on like a low owned play that's just low owned because people aren't looking at things that way. And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, but the upside is there and the play is low owned because you're approaching things from a unique angle. And that's something now that I don't write the whole NFL Edge myself and have to do all the logic research and on paper research myself, I'm working to get back to that of like, how is this team going to, like the Jonas Gray week for the Patriots, right? Like I was the only person who talked about Jonas Gray that week as like a sharp play.
You nailed the Jonas Gray. You're the only person
And it was
who
that was
nailed it.
the DFS. That was before I wrote the NFL Edge at Roto Grinders, right? So
How
it
do
was
you
just
not
like
bring this up every week as the
I'd pick out like 3 or 4 players per position, and Jonas Gray was like one of my highlights at running back that
Did
week.
you
And it's
make
like
$1 billion that week?
thinking, no, I was too scared to play him on my main roster, and then I took him out at like the last minute, and then got
It was a
text.
showdown week, actually, I think.
I got texts all day from people. No, that was that was back when there was main slates was like the whole weekend.
Oh, right.
And I got texts all day Sunday and Twitter messages all day Sunday for like, thanks for the Jonas Gray play. I made this much money. And I was like, I took him out 30 minutes before kickoff.
Oh my God.
But yeah, and you're going to miss on some of those too. But the point is, if you can just think through things from a different angle than everybody else, you come to different sharp plays than the field is coming to. And so the Isaiah McKenzie one is like, if this had been 5 years ago and I was in the rhythm of pulling the trigger on these types of plays, I might have gotten there. But yeah, I mean, just that, like, that's another thing that we can be thinking about on a week like this is less like, what does everything say on paper, and more, how are these teams and coaches going to approach things this week? Because yeah, this is a weird week, super unique week, which if you can then treat it as a unique week, at least you're doing something different than everybody else. And maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't, but that's the way to do it.
I think this is what is so great about DFS and why it's so much fun is, yeah, build a cash lineup. You can play Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and then go cheap with Jamal Williams chalk and Khalil Herbert chalk. But on those GPP lineups, yeah, get unique. Tell yourself a story. Like, oh, no, this is the week Kyler goes off. He's just like arguably just as talented as a runner as Jalen Hurts.
Oh, yeah.
Which, like, is not ridiculous. He has 2 400+ yard passing games in over his last 20 games. This massive ceiling. No one is playing him, and like
he doesn't have the coach or the weapons, but
I don't. So the weapons. I mean, like Hollywood, I think is good. Zach.
Yeah.
Like a decent, PPR.
I love him as my 2 though, not my alpha. Ideally, I love when my favorite is when people say fake sharp Cliff Kingsbury. That's one of my favorites, because like the perception of him is this offensive genius, and it's like, you guys do realize that that's not accurate, right?
So what I was told about Hollywood is that he can be an alpha. Like he's not just like the deep threat. He can do everything, except he's like one of the worst wide receivers in NFL history against press coverage. So it's like fade him against Sauce Gardner, but I don't know. I'll have to look into it. Or the Cleveland. No, who are they playing again? The
Carolina.
Sorry, Carolina. Are they good? J.C. Horn probably. Yeah, he probably is.
All right, I got one question for you before we head out. Somebody actually asked earlier about Justin Jefferson's volume, which is easy. Yes, his volume is going to go up. That's not a concern. But I have a question this week: Saints versus the Vikings, and I think that we could see people jumping off of Justin Jefferson, but he'll probably be matched up with Marshawn Lattimore. Marshawn Lattimore, though, like he was drafted specifically because of the division that the Saints are in. He was drafted specifically to match up with Julio Jones, with Mike Evans, with these big-bodied guys who he's done tremendous with over the years. But sometimes he has trouble with guys who are a little bit shiftier than those big-bodied guys, right? So Justin Jefferson, tremendous route technician. Is this the sort of week, right? We know that the Saints play a lot of man coverage. It's Tuesday, right? So you don't have to give like a firm answer, but is that an interesting matchup to you in terms of, hey, Jefferson can beat Lattimore for like 180-yard game in man coverage throughout this one?
Yeah, I really don't have anything worthwhile, but I'll just like walk you through my thought process here. So he's been shadowed by Jeffrey Okudah and Darius Slay, and he has just 14 yards against them. Terry McLaurin faced shadows against both, and he has 103 yards against both cornerbacks. And so like, that's not great. If you're drafting this guy to be the next Cooper Kupp or ahead of Cooper Kupp, as many were in fantasy drafts, like you would really want more than that. And if he were to have the Cooper Kupp role, he would be moved to the slot. He would be lined up against safeties and linebackers. We saw that in week 1. We haven't really seen him escape these shadow coverages. And it wasn't just shadow coverage by some of the best cornerbacks in football. It was also, there were brackets. I think fantasy players tend to overrate that. Like, it was maybe like 7 total plays across both games of bracket, 0 plays of double coverage. But like, yeah, they were scheming help to his side, which isn't great. Like Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the main benefits is like it's really hard to stop a slot wide receiver. Just, you know, the cushion off the line, the routes they run over the middle of the field, etc. They can be moved everywhere to get more favorable matchups. So that's not great, but I mean, like, the bottom line is this is just glaringly one of the best wide receivers in football. Kirk Cousins, and he's just like one of these volatile guys so I think his production lives and dies on whether or not Jefferson has a good game, and maybe the reverse is true to an extent as well, because this is definitely like who do you want to run the offense through, and he's just always been volatile. He's just like, we think we can predict Kirk Cousins games, and maybe we can't. It's just like he'll just randomly go off for like 350 and 3 scores and 0 picks, and then the next week he'll do nothing. I don't know.
Definitely had some winning low-owned Kirk Cousins weeks from like, why not Cousins this week, you know? And then, yeah, you said, speaking of Darius Slay, I loved this. Justin Jefferson is Darius Slay's son's favorite football player. So
wow.
Slay gave that first intercepted ball to James Harden in the stands. He said he kept the second one for his son. So that was pretty dope. Anything else before we get out of here?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for hanging out. Either one of those. As always, thanks for listening. I hope you guys got something good out of this. Always feel free to let us know if there are things you want us to cover on this podcast. Tuesdays is a nice day because we have flexibility to kind of look behind, look ahead, and get a sense of like what I love about this show is, besides just hanging out with you, Scott, is the chance to talk like about a lot of different things and kind of get our feet, like we don't just focus on the week behind. We don't just focus on the week ahead, but kind of get our feet under us with the NFL as a whole and with some DFS thought processes and all that. So, but yeah, feel free to let us know if there's anything you want to see us adding onto the show.
I had an idea.
Or touching on the show. What's that?
I had an idea.
At the
end of the show, you and I both make a Millie Maker lineup, and like I'll put it in and I'll cover your $10 portion, but just like to walk through the viewers with our process.
I like it. I like it a lot, especially on a Tuesday. We can get kind of those early week thoughts and be fearless with our Millie Maker build and split that money down the middle.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
All right. Thanks you guys for hanging out. We will see you back here next week, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.